The ballroom was filled with hundreds of people when the lights dimmed. Shareholders sat around elegantly decorated tables. Board members occupied the first row. Executives whispered among themselves. Reporters waited with cameras ready. Everyone had gathered for one reason. Sterling International was in trouble. Its stock price had dropped sharply over the previous year. Debt was rising. Several major investors were threatening to sell their shares. And the person standing at the center of the storm was the company's CEO, Victoria Grant. She was 38 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and famous for never admitting she was wrong. Tonight, she intended to convince everyone that she still deserved the CEO position. She stepped onto the stage. Good evening. The room quieted. For the past year, Sterling International has faced unprecedented challenges. She clicked to the next slide. Supply chain disruptions appeared across the screen. Global instability has affected every major company. Another slide. Rising costs. Inflation has damaged our margins. Another. Competitors. We've faced aggressive competition. The shareholders listened. Some looked skeptical. Others looked angry. Near the back of the ballroom, a man pushed a cleaning cart slowly along the wall. His name was Daniel Brooks. He was 41 years old. A single father raising his 10-year-old daughter, Mia. He wore a faded blue maintenance uniform. His shoes were worn. His hands showed years of hard work. Most people in the room didn't even notice him. That was exactly how Daniel preferred it. 18 months earlier, he had accepted a janitorial position at Sterling International. The job seemed strange for someone with his background. But Daniel had his reasons. Before becoming a janitor, he had spent nearly 20 years in corporate finance. He had worked for investment firms, managed mergers, analyzed distressed companies, and eventually became one of the youngest financial strategists in his industry. Then his wife, Rachel, died unexpectedly. Everything changed. Daniel had an 8-year-old daughter who suddenly needed him more than any corporation did. He left his executive career. He turned down lucrative offers. He stopped attending conferences. He stopped appearing in business magazines. He simply wanted to be dad. But raising a child alone was expensive. So when Sterling International offered a flexible night shift janitorial position, he accepted. The salary was modest. The hours were perfect. And nobody cared who he used to be. Daniel could drop Mia at school, pick her up, help with homework, cook dinner, and still work enough hours to keep the bills paid. For 18 months, he had watched Sterling International from the inside. He noticed things executives ignored. Employees complaining about impossible schedules. Managers hiding losses. Suppliers demanding cash because they no longer trusted the company. And most importantly, he noticed the financial numbers didn't match the CEO's public statements. Tonight, as Victoria presented another optimistic projection, Daniel stopped pushing his cart. He stared at the screen. Something was wrong. Victoria pointed proudly toward a graph. Our restructuring plan will stabilize cash flow within 6 months. Daniel quietly whispered, "It won't." The person standing nearby heard him. What? Daniel realized he'd spoken aloud. Nothing. Unfortunately, Victoria heard it too. She stopped. You. Daniel looked up. Yes, ma'am. Did you just say something? Daniel glanced around. I apologize. Victoria stared at him. Could you please continue your work? I'm just cleaning. A few shareholders laughed. Daniel nodded. Of course. He began pushing the cart away. Victoria continued. Then Daniel noticed another figure on the screen. He stopped again. This time, he couldn't remain silent. The debt isn't the problem. Victoria turned. What? Daniel swallowed. The debt structure is. The ballroom went silent. Victoria stared at him. You believe you understand our debt structure? Daniel immediately regretted speaking. I only noticed something. She smiled coldly. Interesting. She looked toward the audience. Apparently our cleaning staff has become a financial consultant. Laughter spread across the ballroom. Daniel lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. Victoria wasn't finished. Perhaps you should focus on the floors. Financial strategy is handled by professionals. Daniel nodded. You're right. He turned away. Then Victoria added. Actually, why don't you clean the floor over there? She pointed toward the stage. In front of everyone. A few executives laughed. Daniel quietly walked forward. He began wiping the polished floor. His face remained expressionless. But the chairman, Charles Whitmore, watched him carefully from the front row. Unlike everyone else, Charles knew exactly who Daniel was. Years earlier, Charles had worked with him. He knew Daniel had personally saved several companies from bankruptcy. He also knew why Daniel had disappeared. Charles had promised never to reveal his identity without permission. Until tonight. Victoria clicked to the next slide. This plan will restore shareholder confidence. Daniel glanced at the numbers, then quietly said, "Not if the bank exercises the acceleration clause." Victoria froze. "Excuse me." Daniel looked up. "The loan agreement on slide 24. You've got a 90-day trigger. If your revenue falls below the covenant, the bank can demand immediate repayment." Several shareholders began whispering. Victoria's face hardened. "Our legal department has reviewed that agreement." Daniel nodded. "I'm sure they have." "Then they know." Victoria walked toward him. "Who exactly are you?" Daniel looked at his cleaning cart. "Someone who reads contracts." The shareholders laughed nervously. Victoria didn't. "Get out." Daniel stopped. "Ma'am, leave this meeting. You've embarrassed yourself enough." Daniel slowly nodded. He pushed his cart toward the exit. But before he could reach the doors, Charles Whitmore stood. His voice carried across the entire ballroom. "Daniel." Daniel stopped. Charles looked directly at him. "Please come back." The room became silent. Victoria looked confused. "Charles, what are you doing?" The chairman didn't answer her. Instead, he opened a leather folder. "I think it's time we stop pretending." He looked at the shareholders. For 18 months, Daniel Brooks has worked inside this company under an assumed position. Victoria frowned. "What does that mean?" Charles smiled. "It means the man you just ordered to mop your floor has been watching every decision you've made." He turned toward Daniel. "Are you ready?" Daniel took a slow breath, then nodded. Charles lifted the first document. "Good. Because tomorrow morning, the board will officially introduce Daniel Brooks as the controlling shareholder of Sterling International." The ballroom seemed to stop breathing. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the reporters had lowered their cameras. Victoria stared at Charles as though he had spoken another language. "The controlling shareholder?" Charles nodded. 38%. Victoria shook her head. "That's impossible." Charles calmly opened the folder. "Would you like to see the documents?" He placed several certified ownership records on the table. Daniel's name appeared across every page. Daniel Brooks, 38%. Sterling International's largest individual shareholder. Victoria looked at Daniel. You were a janitor." Daniel smiled faintly. "I was a janitor. That part wasn't a lie." "Then what was?" "The assumption that it was all I could do." The room erupted into whispers. One shareholder stood. "Why would you work as a janitor if you owned 38% of the company?" Daniel looked toward the audience. "Because I wanted to know what this company looked like from the bottom." He paused. When executives believe they're being watched, they behave differently. But when they think nobody important is around, that's when you see the truth. Charles nodded. For 18 months, Daniel documented operational problems, employee complaints, supplier concerns, financial inconsistencies. He never interfered. He simply observed. Victoria looked furious. "You spied on me." Daniel shook his head. "No, I listened." "There is a difference." One of the board members stood. Daniel provided the board with regular reports. His observations helped us identify problems we didn't know existed. Victoria looked around the room. "Then why did you let me remain CEO?" Daniel answered calmly. "Because I wanted to see whether you would recognize the problems yourself. And tonight, you proved you wouldn't." That sentence hit harder than any accusation. Victoria's face turned pale. Charles turned toward the shareholders. For the past year, the board has investigated Victoria's leadership. Her financial forecasts repeatedly ignored critical liabilities. Several acquisitions were approved without adequate due diligence. And tonight, she publicly presented projections that omitted a major debt covenant. Victoria interrupted. "That's not fair." Charles raised his hand. "Your legal department warned you." She fell silent. A lawyer seated near the front lowered his head. The shareholders began demanding answers. How much debt? When does the bank trigger? Why weren't we told? Who approved the acquisition? The room erupted. Daniel waited patiently. Then he raised one hand. The noise gradually stopped. "Nobody is going to fix this by shouting. We have 90 days. That is enough time." He looked at the financial team. "But only if we stop pretending the problem isn't real." Daniel walked toward the presentation screen. He picked up a marker. "The debt isn't impossible. We simply structured it badly." He drew 3 boxes. First, sell the non-core assets. Second, renegotiate the revolving credit facility. Third, freeze expansion spending for 6 months. An investor interrupted. And employee layoffs. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because the people doing the work aren't the reason we're losing money. The problem is management overhead. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Daniel continued. We have 6 departments performing nearly identical functions. We're paying for duplication. Eliminate the duplication. Not the people. The room became quiet again. Victoria watched him explain the plan. He wasn't angry. He wasn't humiliating anyone. He was simply solving the problem. After 40 minutes, the shareholders voted. The restructuring plan passed overwhelmingly. Then came the second vote. Whether Victoria would remain CEO. The result was decisive. She was removed. Victoria sat silently. Daniel approached her after the meeting. I never wanted to embarrass you. She looked at him. Then why didn't you tell me who you were? Because I wanted your decisions to be based on what you believed was right. She looked away. Would you have treated me differently if you knew? Probably. She gave a bitter laugh. Then you got what you wanted. Daniel shook his head. No. I wanted the company to succeed. And I wanted you to succeed. She looked surprised. Even after tonight? Especially after tonight. Victoria lowered her voice. I was arrogant. Daniel nodded. You were. She almost smiled. You don't sugarcoat anything. I've learned that honesty is cheaper than failure. For the first time, Victoria laughed. A week later, Daniel officially became chairman of Sterling International. But he didn't move into the corner office. Instead, he spent most mornings walking through the factory, talking to employees, listening to drivers, meeting maintenance workers, sitting with accountants. The same people who had once watched him push a cleaning cart now saw him walking through the building with the chairman's badge. One young employee nervously approached him. Mr. Brooks? Yes. I thought you were a janitor. Daniel smiled. I was. What changed? Nothing. I'm still the same person. Months later, Sterling International began recovering. The debt was renegotiated. Unprofitable assets were sold. The duplicated departments were merged. The company returned to profitability. But Daniel made one change that surprised everyone. He kept the janitorial department's flexible schedules. He also created a scholarship fund for employees' children. The first recipient was a maintenance worker's daughter. At the ceremony, Daniel looked out at the audience. Titles change. Money changes. Companies change. But how you treat people remains. He glanced toward the back of the room. Victoria stood there quietly. She had not returned as CEO, but she had started a smaller consulting company. Daniel had become one of her first clients. They had learned something from each other. She had learned humility. He had learned that hiding your identity could protect you from false respect, but sometimes leadership required stepping forward. Years later, the company placed a photograph in its main lobby. It showed Daniel in his old blue janitor's uniform, holding his cleaning cart. Underneath were 7 words. Never confuse someone's position with their potential. Whenever new employees asked about the photograph, someone always told them the story. The CEO who mocked a janitor, the chairman who stopped her, and the single father who quietly owned the company all along. But Daniel never described the story as revenge. Whenever someone called it that, he corrected them. It wasn't revenge. It was a reminder. What reminder? He smiled. Everyone deserves respect before you know what they own. Then he'd return to his work. Because despite becoming one of the most powerful people in the company, Daniel never forgot the reason he had once chosen to become invisible. His daughter Mia still needed her father. And every evening, no matter how important the meeting, how valuable the contract, or how urgent the crisis, Daniel left the office on time. He picked up his daughter. They drove home together. And to Mia, he wasn't a chairman. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't the man who had shocked an entire ballroom. He was simply dad. And Daniel believed that was the only title he would ever truly need.